Today, I'm going to make the case for ethnic nationalism. Now, I have already released an article about this, but it has been updated recently after I finished 6 other articles where I talked about some different topics that are relevant to nationalism and migration. Those 6 articles covered the topics of problematic group differences, how demographics can change, self-determination rights and the complexity with applying them, basic rights that migrants should receive, whether migrants should receive citizenship, voting rights, and representation rights, and finally, I did a quick comparison between individual and collective-leaning political systems. The purpose of those articles was just to think through some important areas in a bit more detail, and that's helped to shape my current thoughts about what political solutions I think make the most sense in different contexts. If you want to read through those articles, you can find them on my Substack, but I'll also add some links to each of them in the description, or at least definitely on YouTube. To make the case for ethnic nationalism, I'll first highlight the problems with civic nationalism. Civic political systems commonly adopt a set of shared political values and embrace equal citizenship. In civic systems, anyone, regardless of their background, can eventually become a citizen and participate in politics. This strong focus on the individual can have a cost for the long-established ancestral populations. Commonly, these populations are who build many of these historical nation-states. Civic nationalism can be problematic for diluting identity. It isn't as concerned with the ethnic composition of a nation-state. All people are supposedly equal. This creates an environment where the identity of the nation can drastically change, and that change may have never been democratically supported by the long-established ancestral population. Another potential problem is around the dilution of culture. Groups can have very different cultures and heritage. The long-established ancestral population may not want to tolerate an increasing presence of certain differences. They might not want to see their cultures change, whether that's their traditions, social norms, cuisine, or even their language, as just some examples. There could be a long list of things that the ancestral population wants to keep exactly as it is. The next problem is around the difficulty of controlling demographic change. The 4 main ways that demographics can change are due to rates of immigration, emigration, death, and reproduction. Out of these 4 ways that demographics can change, the only one that you can more easily control is immigration. But emigration and rates of reproduction and death are much harder to influence or control. So if you have a period of immigration and then give those migrants citizenship, you have created an environment where it is very difficult to influence demographic change, and that change could be significant. Group differences that exist in migrant communities could become the dominant part of the culture due to this demographic change. So this really puts more emphasis on the importance of thinking about citizenship and political membership. Once you accept that the demographics are hard to influence, the long-established ancestral population needs to seriously consider whether it wants to give other groups citizenship. With a civic nationalist system, another problem to consider is how long-established ancestral groups can lose their self-determination as the demographics continue to change. New migrant communities could receive citizenship, and then demographic change could result in new emergent majorities that have a growing amount of voting power. So, with civic nationalism, you can't reliably protect the continuity of the long-established ancestral group and their culture. Institutions are supposed to protect minority rights, but the strength of institutions is only as strong as the will of the majority to enforce those laws and policies. Institutions can change. Their relevance and strength to hold together a nation can change over time. So, civic nationalism in practice can often suppress identity in culture. It enables a more fluid identity and evolving culture. For this system to work, you really need the population to not prioritize the importance and continuity of their identity and culture. If the long-established ancestral population have never agreed to these outcomes in any democratic way, well, this could become a recipe for disaster. Another problem with this civic nationalism experiment is it's not happening equally across the world. It is often the more prosperous nations that have experimented with this civic system. Other countries are still relatively homogeneous. They don't have the same risks around group continuity or with retaining their distinct culture. The risks involved in civic political systems are currently unfolding in some of the most prosperous nations across the world. This isn't really a fair outcome. Some nations get to keep their distinct group differences, whereas others are losing those historical identities and cultures. It's more of a one-way street that's resulting in ethnic and cultural replacement. Another problem we need to mention is around the dysgenic risks of civic nationalism. The average intelligence of each country's population is not the same. There are meaningful differences that still persist between distinct groups. Different ethnic groups within the same nation state in a similar environment have retained persistent differences for average IQ scores. This reality creates a risk for more prosperous nations, especially when they are accepting migration from lower average IQ populations. It is difficult to expect that this won't have any negative ramifications on society due to a decreasing average IQ of the population. Prosperous nations that have adopted civic nationalism are risking the future prosperity and social cohesion within their countries in the name of ideologies like universalism and liberalism. Politics based on how you want the world to be rather than how it is. This is politics based on an ignorance towards the data and observable reality. The more logical position would be that you need to prove that the differences in IQ can be reduced to a negligible amount through environmental changes, or that a nation can be equally prosperous even with a much lower average IQ. Neither of these hypotheses have been proven true. So, I certainly wouldn't create a political system that assumed that these hypotheses were true when they are false until proven true. So, it's safe to say that I think the adoption of liberal ideals with civic nationalism and universalism have been disastrous for many nation states so far. Another problem to mention is the potential collapse of diversity. If each ethnic group and distinct culture is not able to protect its continuity, how can you expect to sustain those differences over the long term? Civic nationalism creates an environment where any group differences can be slowly erased, whether that's the historical ethnic composition or the cultural fabric of each society. If you actually wanted to reliably protect these differences and protect a world that has a huge range of diversity, applying universalism and civic nationalism across every nation state would be a completely disastrous approach. Civic nationalism creates an environment where the groups that reproduce the most should eventually become the most dominant group with voting power in every country. And that wraps up some of the many problems that we need to consider when using civic nationalism. Another reason the adoption of civic nationalism is so concerning is the lack of democratic support it has received since its adoption. Most countries that have adopted a more liberal and universal ideology under civic nationalism have not done so with a democratic mandate. Many of the citizenships that have been given out to migrants have not been done with the democratic support of the long-established ancestral population. So it's not that difficult to see how these problems and this lack of democratic legitimacy could lead to disputes and conflict. The long-established ancestral population, in many cases, never agreed and voted for this change to happen in the first place. They never accepted an increasing loss of self-determination in their own countries. Nationalism, or ethnic nationalism, is the historical form of nationalism that can help with preventing the problems that have been emerging with civic nationalism. With ethnic nationalism, membership in the nation is often based on shared ancestry. In this political system, the long-established ancestral population could be who receives citizenship and political membership. It is only this population that would be able to participate in politics through voting or becoming a representative. That is the totality of this suggested change. An ethnic nationalist solution would determine who receives citizenship and who can vote and become a representative in government. Now, does this mean that all other groups need to be deported? No, of course not. Anyone could live in an ethnic nationalist country. However, it is the long-established ancestral population who are citizens of that country. It is this population that would decide if they are happy for those migrants to live alongside them. So, what are we trying to achieve with the adoption of ethnic nationalism? The objective is to protect the continuity of the long-established ancestral population and their culture within their own country. Countries that can often have a long and rich history with their own distinct identity and culture. A broader goal with the adoption of ethnic nationalism would be that it aims to help with protecting global diversity. Each distinct group would retain their self-determination to govern themselves in their own nation-state. This creates a political solution that can more reliably protect the continuity of these distinct populations across the world. Restricting political membership to just these distinct groups gives them the full autonomy to decide how their nation-state will evolve over time. They decide how the culture changes and evolves. They decide which migrants, if any, will be able to live alongside them. Okay, now let's think a bit about the implementation details. An ethnic nationalist solution is an approach for the nation-state itself, but that doesn't mean you can't have governance solutions that try to include all residents at the local level. National level politics would be handled by the long-established ancestral population, but local decisions could be handled by a larger and more inclusive group of people. Ethnic nationalist societies can be multi-ethnic and multicultural. It would be the long-established ancestral population that decide who lives alongside them and what cultures and differences they are willing to accept in their own society. Ethnic nationalism is a form of collectivism. It helps with protecting the continuity of the long-established ancestral population by only giving them political membership in the nation-state. They decide how the nation is governed. But beyond this, the ideas that are more aligned with individualism can still be adopted. Many of these ideas have been very effective in Western countries. Here's some of the individual-leaning political solutions that could still be adopted. For justice, this can mean treating people as individuals. Laws apply equally to all people, and punishment or reward isn't based on group identity alone. For rights, this could mean protecting liberties and personal autonomy, with rights that act as a shield against state or majority coercion. For responsibilities, individuals would be accountable for their own choices, and they also must respect other people's rights and contribute towards society. For law, a focus on individual guilt, legal equality, and procedural fairness. For the economy, an emphasis on self-ownership, entrepreneurship, contract enforcement, property rights, and voluntary exchange. And finally, for society and culture, enabling pluralism, self-expression, and lifestyle freedom. Now, you could adopt all of these individual-leaning political approaches in an ethnic nationalist society, protecting identity and cultural continuity with ethnic nationalism, and then protecting individual rights and freedoms with individual-leaning laws and policies. So, my thoughts are, collectivism at the national level is very sensible if you want to protect the continuity of a long-established ancestral population and parts or all of their culture. I also believe that ideas that lean towards individualism are still very suitable for handling things like justice, rights, responsibilities, laws, the economy, and even decisions at a local level. The benefit of a collective political membership approach is it gives the long-established ancestral population the autonomy and more certainty around how they govern themselves and protect their own culture and heritage. They get to decide what that means to them and how much they want to protect it. For instance, some countries have religious buildings which are part of their heritage. The population may not be as religious as it was historically, but they still might want to protect that heritage by maintaining it for future generations. When you have a more civic nationalist solution, you give political power to people who have less ties to that heritage. It wouldn't be that surprising that these external groups become less interested over time in allocating resources to maintain that infrastructure, especially when there could be other problems they want to focus on that are more meaningful to them. This is a reason why self-determination matters. It prevents external groups from influencing what the nation prioritizes. The long-established ancestral population should not feel obligated to abandon parts of their culture or heritage. That is something that could have a great deal of meaning to them. This is one of the many examples and reasons why ethnic nationalism is a compelling solution to protect the continuity of these different things. Another concern with ethnic nationalism is, does it mean that other groups in the nation are going to be oppressed? Many laws and rights are becoming increasingly standardized and refined to ensure people can be treated fairly. Good laws are generally very universal. You could adopt them in any country. One of the rights I mentioned in one of the articles was about what basic rights should migrants receive. An example of that was equal treatment rights. Everyone should be able to equally access essential public services and infrastructure. The next thing I mentioned is how you could make this reciprocal, so that someone who just started living in the country isn't able to use the services for free. And that's especially important when they haven't contributed anything to the economy so far. And beyond that, you can think about ensuring that access is capacity constrained. And that's so that services don't become unusable for the nation's own citizens due to a lack of capacity. These types of policies could be adopted anywhere across the world. You also have more foundational laws that help to solve common problems, laws that can be applied universally across any nation state. This is where I think the work from the Natural Law Institute on fixing the United States Constitution will be extremely valuable. A constitution or any of its laws could be adopted anywhere. If countries have adopted these types of universal laws and rights, this is going to help to reduce the likelihood that any given nation state is oppressing a particular group. So, the most compelling places to adopt ethnic nationalism are countries that have a long established ancestral population that wants to protect the continuity of their identity and culture. European countries are some great candidates for adopting ethnic nationalism. Now, it must be said that there are plenty of implementation problems to solve if these countries want to adopt ethnic nationalism. So, this is something I'm going to work on, and I'll likely do a video series to go through the most compelling approaches and solutions that help with the adoption of ethnic nationalism. But until then, I will see you all soon.